March 17, 1943, a cold and silent evening in Berlin. Deep inside the headquarters of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence agency, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris sat alone in his office, surrounded by intercepted reports and decoded Allied data. For months, his agents had been tracking Allied production numbers, trying to make sense of the staggering figures coming out of the United States. That day, a new intelligence brief arrived, one that would change everything. According to sources inside America's industrial sector, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan had reached an unbelievable milestone. 1B-24 Liberator bomber was now being completed every hour. Canaris stared at the document in disbelief. He understood what those numbers meant better than anyone else. If the Allies could produce thousands of bombers every month, Germany's war machine didn't stand a chance. The Luftwaffe was already stretched thin, and German factories, crippled by Allied bombings and fuel shortages, were falling far behind. This wasn't propaganda. It was the cold logic of industrial warfare. The United States, protected by distance and blessed with limitless resources, had turned its economy into a weapon far deadlier than any bomb. As the realization sank in, Canaris's face darkened. He had always doubted Hitler's promises of total victory, but now the numbers left no room for hope. The war had turned into a game of production, and Germany was losing catastrophically. That evening, he called for a quiet meeting with his most trusted officers. One of them later recalled his words. "Gentlemen, this war is no longer about courage or strategy. It is about mathematics, and the numbers are against us. Every day that passes, the enemy grows stronger while we grow weaker." Outside, Berlin was still full of confidence. Propaganda posters, speeches, and marching soldiers filled the streets. But inside the Abwehr offices, the mood had changed. For the first time, German intelligence understood that the Third Reich was standing on borrowed time. Canaris, torn between duty and conscience, began to keep his findings hidden from Hitler. He knew the Führer would never accept the truth. To question Germany's victory was treason, but to ignore reality was suicide. In his private notes that night, Canaris wrote a single line. "The end is already written, only the date remains." And with that, March 17, 1943, became the day. German spies realized that the war, though still raging on battlefields, was already lost in the factories and assembly lines of America. The night after his grim discovery, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris could not sleep. The numbers haunted him: the hourly construction of bombers, the endless streams of supplies, the unstoppable industrial tide of the Allies. He understood what few dared to admit. Germany's defeat was not a question of if, but when. The next morning, as Berlin bustled with false confidence and Nazi propaganda filled the airwaves, Canaris met with his inner circle, a group of intelligence officers who, like him, were beginning to see the madness behind the regime. Men such as Hans Oster, Hans von Dohnanyi, and a few trusted agents from the Abwehr sat silently as Canaris laid the report on the table. "This," he said quietly, tapping the paper, "is the real enemy. Not the British, not the Americans, but arithmetic." The room fell silent. Each man knew what those words meant. Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich had collided with the cold reality of production numbers and logistics. The Allies had factories that never slept, and oceans filled with convoys carrying endless weapons, food, and fuel. Germany's empire, built on conquest and fear, was slowly starving. From that day forward, the Abwehr began to change. It no longer served as a loyal arm of Nazi intelligence. Instead, it became a quiet network of men who sought to limit the damage, to slow down the regime from within. Canaris ordered his agents to divert resources, to feed false reports to the SS, and in some cases, to help save innocent lives marked for execution. Under his leadership, a secret resistance grew. Not one fought with guns, but with silence, secrets, and deception. While Hitler raged in his bunker, convinced that new wonder weapons would turn the tide, Canaris and his men watched the numbers grow worse each week. Allied bombers filled the skies over Germany. The industrial centers of Hamburg, Essen, and Cologne were reduced to ashes. Meanwhile, American shipyards launched new vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Canaris began to see his duty no longer as loyalty to the Führer, but to Germany itself, to what the nation might one day be after the madness ended. His spies started warning neutral nations, protecting captured Allied soldiers, and even leaking intelligence that might shorten the war. But such actions came with a price. The Gestapo grew suspicious. Heinrich Himmler and the SS began tightening their grip around the Abwehr. Reports circulated that Canaris was unreliable, perhaps even a traitor. Still, Canaris refused to stop. To him, the true betrayal was silence, allowing millions to die for a lost cause. Each day he risked his life and by the summer of 1943, his fears had become undeniable truths. The Allies had landed in Sicily, the Eastern Front was collapsing, and the Reich's air defenses were overwhelmed. The mathematical prophecy he had read months earlier had come to life, not on paper, but in fire and ruin. The guns of Europe had finally gone silent. It was May 1945, and the Third Reich had collapsed into ashes. Cities once filled with the march of boots now lay in ruins. Across the shattered landscape, Allied soldiers uncovered the wreckage of a war that had consumed millions of lives. Among the many secrets unearthed in those first chaotic weeks, one name began to reappear: Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. For most Allied officers, he had been known only as Hitler's former spy master, the man who once commanded Germany's feared intelligence service. But soon, reports began to surface suggesting something far more complex. Inside abandoned Abwehr offices, Allied investigators discovered hidden documents, coded messages, and fragments of diaries written by Canaris and his men. The records told a story that stunned even hardened intelligence officers, a story of quiet defiance, of secret warnings sent to neutral nations, and of attempts to protect the innocent amid the darkness. The Allies learned that Canaris had personally intervened to save countless lives, including Jews, prisoners of war, and civilians marked for execution by the SS. His network had secretly passed information to the Vatican, Switzerland, and even to British intelligence, hoping to shorten the war and prevent total destruction. For years, his heroism had been buried under Nazi lies and Gestapo propaganda. But now, the truth was beginning to surface. The man Hitler had called a traitor was being revealed as something very different: a soldier of conscience trapped in a nation gone mad. In one recovered notebook, dated March 17, 1943, investigators found a single haunting line written in Canaris's handwriting: "Numbers do not lie, the war is lost, but I will not let Germany lose its soul." It was a message that summed up everything he had fought for. As post-war tribunals began in Nuremberg, several German officers who had once served under Canaris testified in his defense. Even though he was already dead, they described how he secretly opposed Hitler, how he risked his life to slow the killing, and how his orders often went against the brutality of the SS. One of them, Colonel Hans Oster, who was executed shortly before Canaris, had once said, "He was not a man of war, but a man of conscience. He fought in silence because truth could not be spoken aloud." In the years that followed, historians pieced together the fragments of his life. The world began to see that Wilhelm Canaris was not a mere spy chief. He was one of the few inside Hitler's inner circle who tried to save Germany from itself. Decades later, memorials were built in his name. The German Navy and intelligence services quietly honored his memory, acknowledging that he had stood for moral courage in a time of madness. His diary pages were preserved in archives, a testimony to the man who saw the end before anyone else, and who dared to act against it. It is the 21st century. The world has changed. Satellites now circle the Earth. Algorithms read human thoughts faster than spies once read coded letters. And wars are fought not just on battlefields, but in cyberspace, in media, and in the quiet corridors of information. Yet amid this modern chaos, the spirit of one man still lingers in the minds of those who carry the weight of secrecy. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the spy master who dared to think beyond obedience. Today, his philosophy has evolved into what scholars and intelligence officers call moral intelligence, the belief that knowledge without conscience is the most dangerous weapon of all. In the post-Cold War era, Western intelligence agencies began studying historical figures who had faced moral dilemmas in service. Among them, Canaris stood apart. Unlike most, he did not betray his nation for power, greed, or ideology. He resisted because he understood that a victory without humanity is not victory at all. Modern intelligence schools, from Berlin to Washington, from London to Tokyo, now include lectures titled The Canaris Principle. Cadets are taught that information and loyalty mean nothing if they are not guided by ethics. They learn how intelligence can protect peace, not just manipulate power. In a small conference room at the German Federal Intelligence Academy, a simple display case holds his original Abwehr insignia beside a quote engraved in steel. "The enemy is not across the border. It is within the silence of those who see and do nothing." Every year, young officers gather before it, their reflections visible in the glass. They listen to the story of the man who tried to save his country from moral collapse. Reminder that the truest form of courage often comes without recognition, without reward, and without survival. His teachings have also shaped discussions at global intelligence ethics conferences. Speakers cite Canaris when warning about unchecked surveillance, manipulation of truth, and the temptation to serve politics instead of principle. His life has become a moral compass, a reminder that intelligence must never serve tyranny, even when tyranny wears the face of patriotism. In the digital age, his name reappears in essays, documentaries, and podcasts, often quoted beside modern whistleblowers and truth-tellers who face the same impossible choice, to obey or to speak. And in those moments of doubt, his words return like a quiet echo from the past. Truth will always cost you something, but silence will cost you everything. Canaris's ideas now reach beyond governments. Corporate leaders, military strategists, and journalists alike study his example as a lesson in moral clarity. In Germany, each March 17th is remembered by historians as the Day of Silent Realization, the day one man dared to admit what an entire empire refused to see. A year had passed since that fateful report reached the Abwehr, the day Admiral Wilhelm Canaris realized that Germany's war was lost. The year that followed turned him from a loyal servant of the Reich into one of its most dangerous internal enemies. But by April 1944, the walls were closing in. The Gestapo had begun tracing secret communications, uncovering fragments of a vast network that reached from Berlin to Madrid, from the Vatican to Switzerland. Hidden messages, altered orders, and missing intelligence reports had not gone unnoticed. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, had grown increasingly suspicious of the Abwehr. Himmler's agents whispered to Hitler that Canaris was sabotaging the war effort, that the spy master himself might be a traitor. Hitler, already consumed by paranoia, demanded proof. The first crack appeared when Hans Oster, Canaris's closest friend and deputy, was linked to the July 20th plot, the failed assassination attempt against Hitler led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Though Canaris had not directly planted the bomb, his fingerprints were everywhere in the network that planned it. The conspirators had used Abwehr contacts, Abwehr papers, and even Abwehr funds. When the bomb exploded, and Hitler survived, the fury that followed was unlike anything Germany had seen. The Gestapo stormed the Abwehr headquarters. Files were seized, offices ransacked, agents dragged away in the middle of the night. The name Canaris appeared again and again in the interrogation rooms of the SS. For weeks, Canaris maintained his calm. He denied everything, relying on his reputation and his years of service to the Reich. But deep down, he knew the truth. His time was running out. Then, one evening in September 1944, the Gestapo discovered a hidden diary inside a safe at one of his offices. It contained personal notes, coded names, and reflections that revealed his disgust for Hitler and the Nazi regime. That diary became the weapon that sealed his fate. He was arrested, stripped of rank, and sent to Flossenburg concentration camp, a place meant for men the regime wanted to disappear quietly. There, the man who had once commanded Germany's most powerful intelligence agency was reduced to a prisoner in rags, guarded by soldiers who once saluted him. Despite months of interrogation and isolation, Canaris never betrayed his men. Even when shown the execution lists, even when tortured, he refused to give the Gestapo the names of those who had stood beside him. By April 1945, the war was in ruins. Berlin was burning. Allied troops were closing in from every direction, and the Reich was collapsing. In those final weeks, Hitler's wrath turned toward those he blamed for betrayal, the conspirators, the thinkers, the doubters. On April 9, 1945, an order came directly from Berlin, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, to be executed immediately. 2 decades after the fall of the Third Reich, Europe was divided once again, not by war, but by ideology. The Cold War had drawn an invisible line across the continent, separating East and West, freedom and control. Yet, amid the growing tension between superpowers, the story of one man, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, began to re-emerge from the shadows of forgotten history. For years after World War II, Canaris's name remained controversial. In post-war Germany, speaking of resistance within the military was dangerous. Many still viewed him as a traitor who had betrayed his oath. Others whispered that he had tried to save the nation from total destruction. It would take time and truth to rewrite that judgment. By the 1960s, historians and intelligence officers on both sides of the Iron Curtain began digging through captured Nazi archives. In the dusty files of the Abwehr, they uncovered reports, letters, and secret diaries that painted a portrait far more complex than anyone had imagined. Here was a man who had once served the empire, but quietly fought to destroy its tyranny from within. A man who had hidden behind the mask of loyalty while plotting the moral salvation of his country. One British historian, Hugh Trevor Roper, who had worked in wartime intelligence, famously said, "Canaris was not only a spy, he was a moral compass trapped inside a nation that had lost its direction." Soon, films, books, and documentaries began to explore his mysterious double life. Authors described how he used his position to protect Jews, priests, diplomats, and even Allied agents, how he fed false information to the SS, and how he misled Hitler's generals to delay or derail destructive plans. By the 1970s, Canaris was no longer seen merely as a German officer. He was recognized as part of a small, tragic brotherhood of conscience, men like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Klaus von Stauffenberg, and Hans Oster, who dared to resist evil from within. But even then, his legacy remained delicate. Some critics still called him indecisive, a man who saw the truth but acted too late. Yet others argued that his subtle resistance saved countless lives and exposed the moral rot at the heart of the Nazi regime. When Germany was finally reunified in 1990, the archives of East Germany opened, revealing even more evidence of his secret work. Intelligence reports showed that Canaris had communicated indirectly with the Allies through neutral nations, sharing details that later helped shorten the war. He had also tried, unsuccessfully, to convince Spain and Turkey to remain neutral, to keep the flames of war from spreading further. At long last, his name began to receive the honor it deserved. The German Navy quietly restored his rank posthumously. Intelligence academies began teaching his life story, not as one of treachery, but as an example of ethical intelligence, where truth and humanity outweighed blind obedience. More than 80 years have passed since that cold March evening when Admiral Wilhelm Canaris stared down at a single piece of paper and the report that told him the truth. The war was lost. But his story did not end in 1945. It did not end in Flossenburg. It lived on, quietly, in the minds of those who understood that truth. Not power shapes the destiny of nations. In today's world of technology, surveillance, and global intelligence, the lessons of Canaris feel more alive than ever. Governments rise and fall. Nations build vast networks of data, secrets, and silence. And somewhere within them are people who must choose between obedience and conscience, between comfort and truth. Modern historians now call this the Canaris dilemma, the eternal question faced by those who see injustice from within. Do you stay silent to survive, or do you speak and risk everything? Around the world, from journalists uncovering corruption to intelligence officers revealing hidden crimes, the spirit of Canaris quietly endures. His story has become a mirror, one that reflects the same moral struggle in every age, the courage to defy wrong even when no one else will. In lectures across Europe and the United States, his life is now discussed not just as history, but as a warning and a guide. Professors speak of him as a man who walked the fine line between duty and defiance, a reminder that true patriotism sometimes means standing against one's own leaders when they have lost their way. The German Navy still keeps his portrait, a silent figure in uniform, eyes full of thought, inside its historical museum. Beneath it, a small plaque reads, "He served Germany, but he served truth first." Each year, intelligence cadets visit that portrait. They are told about his quiet resistance, his hidden compassion, and his moral courage in the darkest age of modern history. For many, it is the first time they realize that integrity is the highest form of strength soldier or spy can possess. Filmmakers and writers continue to rediscover him. In documentaries, his calm voice is reconstructed through diary readings. In books, his story becomes a symbol, the lone man who fought a war within a war. And in classrooms, his quote still resonates, "A nation that loses its conscience has already lost the war." Today, in a world once again divided by propaganda, misinformation, and political extremes, his words feel prophetic. They remind humanity that wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with truth, moral courage, and the will to say no when silence becomes complicity. Some historians now argue that Canaris did not simply lose his life, he planted an idea that would outlive the empires of his time, that the greatest act of resistance is not destruction, but decency. His name may not appear in many textbooks, but his influence runs quietly through the veins of every institution that values justice over blind obedience. Decades after the war ended, history continued to whisper the name Wilhelm Canaris. For many, he was still a shadow, a man half forgotten, half remembered. But in the early 2000s, new discoveries would finally bring his hidden truth to light. In archives long sealed beneath layers of dust, in Berlin, London, and Washington, historians began unearthing fragments of intelligence reports, intercepted telegrams, and personal notes that had been locked away since 1945. These were not ordinary military records. They were the secret files of the Abwehr, handwritten and signed by Admiral Canaris himself. Each file told a piece of a story the world had never fully heard. A story of a man waging a silent war not against the Allies, but against his own regime. The documents revealed how Canaris used his power to manipulate the Nazi war machine from within. He delayed the deportation of Jews by sending false intelligence about strategic value. He redirected trains, marked for concentration camps by claiming they were carrying essential military supplies. In some cases, he personally ordered forged identity papers to help families escape the Gestapo's reach. He wasn't a man of open rebellion. He was a man of quiet sabotage, fighting a war of conscience beneath the shadow of tyranny. Among the newly released papers was one dated March 17, 1943, the same day his realization had struck. In it, Canaris wrote, "The machine of war grows stronger than the men who command it. The enemy is not across the sea. It is the blindness within." That sentence became one of the most quoted lines in modern intelligence history. Scholars, soldiers, and historians began to study Canaris not as a traitor or hero alone, but as a complex man, one torn between duty and morality, loyalty and truth. In 2010, Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, BND, formally honored him with a historical exhibition titled Canaris, the Spy Who Chose Conscience. It displayed his original letters, his coded messages, and even fragments of his personal journal smuggled out of Flossenburg before his execution. Visitors read his final reflections, words that still carried pain and prophecy. There will come a time when truth will be the last weapon. That is when our children must choose what kind of Germany they wish to build. The exhibition drew thousands, including modern intelligence officers from across the world. Many admitted that Canaris' story reshaped how they viewed the meaning of intelligence work, not just as strategy, but as moral responsibility. In universities and military academies today, his life is studied under a new light. The lessons drawn from his resistance have become part of ethical intelligence training. A reminder that the greatest enemy of truth is not lies, but silence. Documentaries and films continue to tell his story, each trying to capture the mystery of the man who saw the fall of his nation long before anyone else.